Welcome to our class today. Today we're going to consider the passage in James chapter 1, verses 16 to 20. We have a lot of things we want to talk about today, so let's just dive into the class. I wanted to ask you a question as we got started. The question is a very simple one, but one that's kind of threatening, frankly. When have you gotten angry? Now, before you say, oh, I never get angry, I think we all can confess for each one of us. There are always times when we get angry. It may be that when we're in traffic and we're waiting behind a car in heavy traffic at a stoplight and the light turns green, the car doesn't move in front of us. And you notice they're busy on their phone looking at something meaningless while the light is ticking away and you may not even get through it. It's happened to me before, and you don't feel very positive about that person in front of you. Perhaps it's something that someone says to you. They do something offensive or they say something offensive. You wore that shirt. I can't believe you wore a shirt that ugly. Now, some people are built that way. I understand that. But you can get very hurt and you get very angry. How dare they say that to me? And we can have our employers reprimand us and we think it's unfair and we get angry. And inside we go, I'll just go back and write my resignation letter right now. It's an interesting problem. And anger creates all kinds of havoc in our society. We are on an uptick in America, especially on anger. Just think about some of the things that comes out of anger. There is more road rage today than perhaps before. Now, it used to be road rage meant somebody would drive by, they would shake their fist at you, say some words they probably shouldn't have said, and then go on. You may feel irritated. You may not like what they said, but they also just went on and nothing happened. Today, road rage means someone pulls out a semi-automatic weapon and fires into a car, hitting a kid and killing him. That's serious. But if you go through social media at all, you hear those traces, that sheer white-hot napalm of words that's dropped into social media posts that just excoriates anything they don't like on the basis, I have a right to say whatever I want to say, and I don't care if it hurts your feelings or not. Anger is at an all-time high, it seems. And we don't seem to know how to fix it. And that's where James comes in. He wants us to explore that in this lesson. But the question I really want to ask you today, as well as when did you get angry? Was it worth it? Did it help you? Because if it's not helping you be a better Christian, a better husband, a better wife, a better mother, a better father, a better church member, then shouldn't we find a way to do something about that? And so today, James wants to build a foundation first on what he's going to consider the rest of his book, which is the practical way of living for Christ. And you have to build a house on a firm foundation. And in this lesson, he begins with the foundation before he moves on to the practicalities. It all begins in the very first verse of our lesson today, verse 16. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Simple one sentence verse. Do not be deceived. But the way James puts the verse, at least in the original language, is quit being deceived. They were already being deceived about something. Now, deception simply means to have someone lead you astray or put you on the wrong road or tell you the things that will get you going in the wrong direction. It's being naive enough to believe that everybody's going to tell you the truth. But there are people who say, you need to do this. And you listen to them and you find yourself all messed up and you go, I don't understand why they did that. That's deception. But we let ourselves be deceived. We have to do the believing. We have to do the accepting to be deceived. Now, the question then is, what has deceived them? What's been the problem in their lives that has created this dilemma for them where James has to say, stop being deceived? I'd suggest that it probably goes back to the previous lessons. If you take the first several verses of James, James has been talking about trials. And the trials that come in many kinds, and trials are going to test us, and trials are going to reshape us, and mold us, and make us, and give us perseverance or steadfastness. They're going to produce the character we need as a Christian. That's what we've been looking at. But then the next time we looked at that, they got down to temptation, and people had a complaint. The complaint was, all of my troubles in life are because of God doing it to me. And if God loved me, why does He do that to me? It's easy to blame God. It's easy to blame others. It's easy to blame anything but me. And it's easy to look at trial not as something that produces good, but something that's designed to crush us. And if God really cared about me, why would He do that? And that's why that verse that we looked at last week in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, or He Himself tempts no one. We looked at that last week. God is incapable of either thinking or doing evil things, so He will never inflict it upon us. Still doesn't stop people from accusing God of not caring about their lives. After all, haven't we all thrown a pity party at which we are the honored guest? We've been wronged. This is not fair. I wish it were over. I don't know where God is when I'm hurting. If God really loved me, He wouldn't let me go through all of this. Take whatever verse you want in that little litany. We've all at least had the thought about that at certain times. And because of that, we deceive ourselves to think, where is God? Is God the same God? Is He the same person? Does He really love me? Does He really care about me? Maybe I've got this thing wrong with God. At least that's how James saw what his audience was thinking about when they were being deceived. So he says, stop being deceived. You got to go get the map, find out the road you're on, and go back to God. Quit looking at your problems and start looking at God. Is God really the way you're portraying Him in your deceptive mind? And so in the lesson today, in verse 17, he begins by saying, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Anything that's good in our life has come from God. Now he says this in a different way. It looks like it's repeating itself, that every good gift and every perfect gift, that those look like the same things. In fact, there are some translations, every good and perfect gift. But really, the translation that's in the English Standard Version kind of captures the flavor of it better. Because while the words are similar, they're not the same. One describes the manner of the giving, while the other describes the gift. What James is saying is, God is a good giver of good gifts. In the method He gives, it's good, and the result that He gives is good. You see, God is doing the things that are beneficial. There's the word good there. It's not always pleasant, but it's beneficial. It's for our own good. It is a blessing for us, objectively. And so God is the perfect giver of great and good gifts. All of His gifts are the perfect ones for humanity, for the whole, the mature, the ideals. They're all there because He is a good giver of good gifts. He said, so we receive these gifts and they come down from the Father of lights. Then he goes on to say, in this strange phrase, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Those are the words in here that we go, I wonder what that means. It's interesting that the words that and the terms that he uses seem to flow out of that concept, Father of lights. It's kind of an astronomical term, the lights of the heavens. He is the Father over all the things of the heavens. And so he uses the term in whom there is no variation. The word that we bring into English from that word is the word parallax. Now, parallax is a strange concept, and I know that I will never do it justice because I'm not an astronomer. But parallax is an astronomical term that basically means when you change your position, what you see changes. Things change depending on your vantage point. If you take a 3D picture and you move to the left or the right, you see different things. That's parallax. And so, for instance, in the wintertime, the constellation Orion appears in the southeastern sky very prominently. But as you move toward summer, it drops below the horizon. Did it disappear? No. We just take a different vantage point. We can't see it at that moment. One of the things that James says is just because we don't see God's blessing doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because we interpret God wrongly does not mean that God is who we say He is. There is no adjustment for our viewpoint in God. God is a good giver of good gifts all the time, regardless of whether we are seeing it correctly or not. And he goes on to say about the shadow of change. Actually, that's a single word put together. The shadow which is change. There is no hint, there is no sense, kind of like the phases of the moon. The moon is exactly what it is. But there's a shadow that's cast over that makes us think it has changed shapes. And the shadow hides the things that we need to see. There's nothing that hides who God is. He is who He is. Now, the upshot of this is that God is not fickle. God is not capricious. God doesn't change from day to day. He doesn't get up one morning in a bad mood and the next morning he wakes up in a good mood. And so you never know who you're going to get at breakfast. That's not God. God is the good giver of good things all the time. And whatever happens in your life that God allows, He knows it's good, regardless of how you and I see it. So before you're deceived, you need to back off, get a little objectivity, and realize something, that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father. But the third thing he says in this is that He gave us birth. He goes on to say in verse 18, of His own will He brought us forth. He decided, it was His idea to give us birth. Now this probably indicates the spiritual birth that comes from baptism. Because he says by the word of truth, which tells you this is the spiritual birth. But I think it's interesting that in this passage that word brought forth is that word for the child leaving a mother's womb and being born into the world. And it's only used 2 times in the New Testament. One is here, where it talks about the good birth into life. The spiritual birth that God willed to give us. We have the positive new birth. But the only other time it's used in the New Testament is in James 1 again. And that's what we looked at last week. James 1:15, where it talks about when sin is fully grown, it brings forth death. Same words. Same idea. The contrast is kind of hard to miss if you understood the wording. Because he says, when sin gives birth to something, it brings death. When God gives birth to something, it brings life. So if God is the giver of life, why would you doubt that? But there's something else in there buried with it, so that we become a kind of first fruits of His creatures. Now we're aware of the term first fruits in the Old Testament. It was the first fruit on the vine. What made it important was it proved something. It proved there was life in that plant. If you have an apple tree and it's never produced apples, you begin to wonder if it's alive or not. But that first apple that comes on the apple tree, that first fruit, proves there's life there. And that's why it became so important. It was an exciting time for an agricultural economy. There's really life here. I can imagine. It amazes me. This is really growing something, isn't it? And so it was prized and treasured, and that's why first fruits became sacrifices. But in the first century, the Greek word first fruits had another concept that went with it. In fact, the language of the first century Greek was what was called the Common Greek, and it tended to have different connotations to it, and this word was one of those. And the other connotation it has is to be a birth certificate. A birth certificate is a proof of your citizenship, a proof of your legality. And one thing that James says is, we are the proof of the goodness of God of all his creatures. He created us at the top of the ladder, and we are the proof of his care and his love and his concern. It's interesting that when James talks about God here, and you get clear on God and it avoids the deception of life, if you remember that he's a good giver of good gifts, that God's goodness is when God does what is best for us. So what happens in our lives, no matter how we see it, God is doing what is in our best, and because of that, we can truly live for him. And that's what James wants to talk about. How do you live righteously for God in a practical way? And on that foundation, that God gives us everything we need in a loving, caring way and never changes, he launches into a long section that will take place most of the book. And it starts with an interesting topic. He says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." So, let me ask you the question. Is anger wrong? You can read this passage and others in the New Testament and say, well, of course it's not wrong, but isn't that kind of how you were raised? When people say, you should never get angry. I've even heard it said, anger is a sin, even though you can't put your finger on that verse, I guarantee you. But we have this negative sense that if you get angry, you have sinned because you became angry. And yet anger is nothing more than a human emotion that arises as a danger signal, that something is terribly out of whack. And you better do something about it now because it's getting worse and worse if you don't. James says, be slow to anger. He doesn't say, don't get angry, because we can't do that. The question is, what do you do with the anger? I always remember Mr. Rogers, he had a song that said, what do you do with the mad that you feel? Well, that's what James wants to talk about. Now, the next question is, why do you get angry? I suppose there are a lot of answers to that question. One is we get hurt. We can peel this onion down to the stink if we need to. Well, why did you get hurt by that? Well, see, a lot of times we feel like we have been diminished, our egos have been bruised, or we're not being taken seriously, or people don't like me, and I want them to like me. There are all kinds of things. But let me go on and say one reason we get angry is misunderstanding. About 99% of the problems I've had with anger in my life, and I'm sure it's yours, is because you didn't have a good grasp of what was really happening. And you interpreted something that was happening. Now, there is such a thing as righteous indignation. Few people can really do that. Well, Jesus could. What's even harder for us is we have self-righteous indignation. We get upset about something that happened to us because it hurt us and made us feel certain things. Those kinds of anger, that source of anger, is what James wants to address. But the last question I think we need to explore about that before we launch into how James addresses it is, how do you get angry? You may not have ever thought about how you get angry. I think it's good to do a post-mortem when you get angry every once in a while, where you put the corpse of your anger on the table and you open the sheet and you cut him up and say, oh, I know why the anger came up. This is it. Because most of the time we get angry, we never think about why we got angry. And so we never learn lessons from it. But it's interesting what is happening here. James uses a particular word for anger in the 19th verse. It is a Greek word called orge. Now, there were two kinds of anger. Greek had this fine delineation of information. For instance, we all know that love is not love. It's not love in Greek. You can have the love of a family and a child. You have a love of friendship. You can have a social kind of like, if you will. And then you can have the love that a husband and wife has for each other, the passion. And you can have the love that cares for the needs of other people sacrificially, where you do what is in their best interest, even if it's not in yours. Agape love. That's true about when you get to another sense here, and that's anger. On one side, you have thumos, which I would suggest it could be best called rage. Thumos blows up. It just explodes. And then it cools quickly. But then there's another kind that I'll call wrath. Wrath is long lingering. It is seething. It is a boiling, growing body of rage. The event is gone, but the residue of the emotion not just remains, but it continues to grow as we tell ourselves the story about what happened and why we ought to be angry and why this is bad and how come this happened to me. And I don't understand those people. And we work ourselves all up over time when we get angry. That's the anger that James speaks of in this passage. Have you ever been angry too long? Of course you have. But the reasons are very simple. That's the way we are made if we're not careful. You see, things happen to us. Someone walks by us and doesn't speak to us. We all daydream, and we sometimes ignore people to our own discredit, but we do. The person who is not spoken to interprets that and says, they must be upset. I don't know. They must not like me anymore. They thought I was, and they start building a story. Now, as soon as you walk by and you have ignored them and you have gone 2 steps, that event is gone. What remains is the interpretation, the story, the narrative that's growing inside. And the longer it goes, the worse it gets. Until finally, there is a breaking apart of things. This smolder erupts at a different time, in a different place, and no one knows what happened. This is how family feuds get started. One person does something to somebody else, the families don't speak to each other, generation after generation passes the anger down, and after about the 2nd or 3rd generation, you ask the question, what happened to start this? And they go, I don't know. They don't remember. All they know, they're supposed to be mad at this. Now, this is the problem that I encountered. I found out one of the best ways to meet all your neighbors is to have a house fire. Now, I know that sounds strange, but about 16 years ago in our neighborhood, my wife roused me from a sound sleep and said, I wonder what all those lights are. So I got out and peeked through the blinds, and there were fire trucks there, and the house across the street from us was on fire. So we both put on robes and slippers and went out into a cooler November night than we were used to. We weren't the only ones. The whole neighborhood turned out to see the fire. If you want to have a block party, do it in the middle of a house fire. Everybody shows up. And while we were there, we watched the firemen work, and after about an hour, the fire seemed to be out. And so we all said our goodbyes, and we went back in and tried to get what little sleep was left of the night. But the next morning when I got up, I went outside and there was still a fire truck across the street. Fire was out. It was obvious it was out. All you could see was the smoke rising, and you could smell the terrible smell of burnt timber. But I remember someone asked him that day, why are you here if the fire is out? He said, just because the fire is out doesn't mean the fire is gone. There may be a hot spot that flares back up. It may be smoldering. That's what happens with anger. It can smolder. And over time, if it's not dealt with, you don't solve the problem that created it in the first place, and it just gets worse. So James wants to address the problem of the boiling pot. How do you get the steam out of your anger? That's one way of saying what James is trying to say here in a very modern way. So he says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear." That's his first point. Quick to hear. Are you quick to hear? You know, being quick to hear is a difficult thing for most people. They assume they have heard rightly, and then they don't know what to do. One of the things that James wants to say in this passage is if you're going to be slow to anger, you've got these other things in front of it that lead up to it. This is a building block. You do this, and that's what this is, then you do this. The first is being quick to hear. Now, what does that mean? Quick means to be quick, to be fast, to be speedy. The question that you need to ask yourself if you want to be quick to hear is, did you hear what they said, or did you hear what they meant? Those are different things, by the way. Haven't we all spoken in a way that we were misunderstood, that we were not as clear as possible? It's something else that when we speak that we're clear enough where they know what we intended to say, but few of us ever do. We know what we think inside, and we just assume everybody else knows what we think inside too. But they have a different dictionary in their own minds. You know? And the hardest thing to believe in is we communicate clearly, because we don't. And because intention is very important, and if you're not careful, the intention will come back to bite you. I remember one time there was a woman in one of the churches I served that she was a schizophrenic and bipolar. You really never knew who was going to show up at any given time, if she was on her medication or not. You never did know. But we kind of had to deal with her on a regular basis. And I remember one time she called me and she needed a piece of equipment for a family reunion. And so I had one. And so I took it to her, showed her how to use it, left it with her. And later on, after the event, I asked her, I said, "Did that work out for you?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I'm glad it worked." At that moment, she said, "What do you mean by that? You think I can't do anything, don't you? You think I'm a complete idiot, don't you?" Now, that came out of left field, I got to tell you. I didn't know what to do with it, really. The reason was she heard words that she hooked meaning to, that I had no earthly idea that's what she was going to take from that conversation. And she didn't ever stop to ask me, "Did you mean to say that?" Because that's what I heard. Being quick to hear means asking a lot of questions. There are times we probably ought to stop and say, "Now, I probably have gotten this wrong because I'm not sure I completely understand, but this is what I heard you say, and this is what I think you meant. Is that what you meant, or did I get that wrong?" You see, you're trying to hear it. You're trying to hear it easily. You're trying to make sure the words and the meaning and the intonations come out here. You're quick to hear. You're rushing to make sure you understand. And that's one of the things that James is talking about. You rush to understand. And that means you have to be careful and check all the words and all the meanings, lest misunderstandings take place. But then he comes to the second part. Be slow to speak. Slow to speak is the words he uses for slow means to hesitate, to be halting, to be choppy, almost a stammer. He says, be hesitant to speak. In your speaking, be hesitant. Why is that? Have you ever noticed what happens when people get upset? They don't get upset this way. They don't say, "Now, Joe, I think you're wrong about that. In fact, you've been wrong about a lot of things in your life. And, sometimes you're just kind of stupid, don't you think?" Nobody ever does that. This is how it works. What do you mean by that? You think I don't understand what I'm doing? You think I don't care? I don't understand why you think that. In fact, I think you just think that about me all the time. Now shake your head for a moment, get back to normal, and let's see what happens. The equation for anger is this: heat plus speed equals emotion. Because when we get angry, we talk fast. And the faster we talk, the louder we talk. The volume goes up, the speed goes faster. We never stopped to listen anymore because we're so busy trying to make our point. But James says, be slow to speak. Be quiet when you speak. Be slow. Be halting. You may need to say, I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're saying. Are you saying this or this? Well, what I would like to say is I think this may be a good thing to think about right now. Do you hear how slow, how calm that is? It's awfully hard for other people to get upset. It's awfully hard for you to get upset if you're moving at that rate. But that's the hard part too. But if you're quick to hear and you're trying to understand and you're slow to speak to where when you speak you don't rush ahead, then you're slow to anger. You stop the anger in its tracks and you slow it down to where it can dissipate before it begins to boil. You take the lid off the pot and let it cool down when that happens. Most of the problems we have in churches come from misunderstandings and overstatements. And you can solve a lot of church fights if you just listen to what James has to say here. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. It takes a lot of the problems out of our congregations. But why? Why does James say this? James says it because of verse 20. For the anger of man does not work or does not produce the righteousness of God. You can never do the Lord's will. You can never do what the Lord asks you to do with a head full of anger. It just doesn't work that way. If we want to be representatives of the God we serve, we've got to find a way to deal with our irritations in life. We have to learn that we don't shout at people and we don't demean people, and we listen and we try to calm the waters and settle them so that no one gets angry. Because we're never going to do the work of God. We're never going to produce the righteousness which we ought to be mirroring in an agitated state. Instead, we ought to think about God as He plods along doing what is best for other people. And that's what we are supposed to do. The anger of man does not produce that. So James says we serve a God who gives good gifts in the best possible way for our benefit. And so don't accuse Him of not showing up in your life or being different. He's always true, even if you don't see Him. But then he says you need to find a way to bring the temperature down in your life. How do you bring the temperature down when you're angry? Just three practical things that I think kind of flow out of some of the implications of this passage. One is to stop and remember. Remember that you have hurt other people too, and that you have been misunderstood, and that things have not worked out always the same way for you. Be a little bit more compassionate, more empathetic with that. Because if you'll just stop and remember that you have been in the other person's shoes at some point, you can ease off the gas pedal a little bit. Secondly, assume you're misunderstood when you speak. I suppose one of the things that can prevent a lot of upset stomachs and upset people is to say, now, I'm trying to say this. What did you hear me say? You're encouraging them to listen, and you're speaking slowly. You're doing all the things that James had to say here. And most of the time, if you assume that you're going to be misunderstood, you don't respond to things that come back that doesn't sound right. Oh, you may have misunderstood. I may not have made myself clear. I was trying to say this. Is that what you heard? Slow to speak. But the third is respond with good. That last passage we looked at about producing the righteousness of God. One of the cures to anger, I firmly believe, is doing that. You cannot be angry and do good for another person at the same time. So find something that if you are angry with someone, find something good to do for them. Or if they're mad at you, find something good to do for them, for them as well. Because doing good, you can't do good and remain angry. You can't do positive things for someone and feel negatively about them. Do something good for somebody, and your life will change. You then will slow down the anger. It will halt. Perhaps if we listen carefully to James, we can all have better families, better churches, and better selves, as long as we are quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Thank you for joining me, and we'll be back again next week with another lesson.